Okay, welcome back, biology students. Today we're going to talk about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis can be divided into two phases, the light dependent, so they depend on light, and the light independent, it's independent of, it doesn't need light reactions. Today I'm just going to talk about the light dependent reactions, so those that require sun, to chunk it up a little bit and make it easier for us to study piece by piece in order to understand. So what do we hope to learn from this? So let's look at our two objectives here. We need to be able to explain cause and effect relationships that occur throughout the light stages of photosynthesis. So I think if you look at all the details of photosynthesis, it's very overwhelming. And it's easy to have a negative thought on it and think, I can't possibly learn all this. But if you think about this as a cause and effect process, it's so much easier to walk your way through it, to talk your way through it. So one thing happens, and that's going to cause the next thing to happen. And it's going to continue that way because it's a pathway where each piece relies on what has already happened. So tell it like a story. And if you do it that way, it's going to be easier for you to remember and to understand. So in each of the pieces we talk about, I'm going on to the second objective now. You want to identify the products and the reactants, both of the overall process of photosynthesis and of individual pieces, the individual stages that we're going to talk about. There's light absorption, there's electron transport, there's the Kelvin cycle. So for each of those three pieces, what goes in and what comes out? That's what you want to know, okay? So I'll explain a little bit of the details, but don't get carried away with them, okay? So for photosynthesis, let's look at the big picture, and then we'll break it down and talk about the little pieces. So in all, basically what's happening, light energy is trapped and is converted into chemical energy. So we're taking energy from the sun and we're turning it into something that the organisms can use, whether it's a plant, an animal, a bacteria, whatever. So we need to make some sort of chemical energy. You will be asked to recite this equation. So some of science is memorization and some of science is understanding and applying information. So first, let's memorize the equation. 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6O2. Now can you say that with words rather than letters? 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 waters makes glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. That's a little bit of detail. Overall, what's happening? Carbon dioxide and water are being converted into glucose and oxygen. You need to know that. Know the reactants, what goes in, know the products, what comes out. So I like to make connections with things we already know. So in class, we would do a little bit of an all write. So everybody would write what they thought, and then we would discuss them. But we're just going to jump to the discussing. So what organelle captures the sun's energy? So I'm making connections to earlier chapters. In our class, chapter 7, we talked about organelles of the cells, and we know that the chloroplast collects the sun's energy. So we need to know that. That's a test question. Where in the plant are these organelles likely found? Not in the cell itself, but in the whole plant. Where do you find chloroplasts? Chloroplasts are associated with green colors, so where's the green colors in plants? Mostly in the leaves. So where do you think photosynthesis is occurring? Mostly in the leaves. So what is the name of the pigment that absorbs the sun's energy? Hopefully you know this is chlorophyll. They absorb certain wavelengths of light and they reflect other wavelengths of light. So chloroplast, for example, appears green because it is reflecting green light and it's absorbing all the other colors, mostly in the red spectrum and the blue spectrum. The sky, the water, they appear blue because they're absorbing green lights and red lights and yellow lights, and they're reflecting blue lights. So pigments appear certain colors because that's the color they're reflecting. So it's important we understand how pigments work, since pigments are ultimately driving photosynthesis. So here are some pigments that are associated with plants that would be relevant to this topic. Chlorophyll, we know, is green. So it's going to reflect, it's reflecting down here, this color spectrum. any of the green lights. It's going to absorb a little bit down here in the blue-violet range, and it's going to absorb a little bit up here in the red-orange range. Leaves don't appear red-orange or blue-violet, right? In the fall they do because of carotenoids. So carotenoids are another set of pigments. Some of them reflect orange, red, yellow, and so we see those leaves colors in the fall. These pigments are also photosynthesizing. They're just absorbing different wavelengths of light, and they're reflecting different wavelengths of light. Since the sun is at a different angle, we're getting wavelengths hitting the plants a little bit differently. So the carotenoids are found in fruits and vegetables, in flowers, and in certain fungi and bacteria, but they're also in plants. And so the carotenoids, I typically think of the word carrot, and I know it's colors near the orange range, right? So there's going to be a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, and a little bit of orange. So that's the colors they're reflecting. Xanthophylls reflect yellow, more of the yellow range, and then the carotenes reflect more of the red-orange range. So those are called accessory pigments. So we're going to talk about photosynthesis. There's a lot of details here. I think looking at graphics and being able to talk about graphics is a great way to study and understand photosynthesis or any science process. A lot of kids will tell me they studied their notes for hours. What did you do with those notes? They just read them over and over again. That's not a way that you're making sense of the information, and you have to do the work. I present it in a way that makes sense to me. That might not be something that makes sense to you. So if you don't physically do some work with that information, you're not likely to make pathways that are going to help you find that information in your brain. So take a picture. Talk about it. What do I see here? I see a photosystem. What's a photosystem? A photosystem is a cluster of pigments, in this case chlorophyll pigments. I see there's two different photosystems. What is this P680 and 700? That means they're absorbing different wavelengths of light. This one's absorbing 680, this one's 700. And at first year of biology, you don't need to know those numbers, and you don't need maybe to understand that, but know that there's two different sets of pigments. I see suns here. What's the sun doing? It's got this red light going this way and blue light's going this way, so it must be transferring its energy. And then what are all these arrows bouncing around? Since they started with the sun, it must be that energy, so that energy is bouncing around. So the photons of light are bouncing until they reach this section. Oh, that's a reaction center. So something's happening there. So what's happening? And then I follow the arrow. Electrons. Electrons are being excited. Okay, so sun is hitting the chlorophyll pigments and exciting electrons. Got it. Over here I see something else is happening. I see water is being split into oxygen and hydrogen. And I think these electrons are associated with the water. I know electrons bond hydrogen and oxygen, so maybe that's the electrons that once were bonding the hydrogen and oxygen. So when we split water, we release electrons. They go into the photosystem that once lost electrons. So talk about those pictures, right? That's a great way for your brain to make sense of information. So we're going to talk about this whole process. I'm going to explain it in the slides that are coming up, so I don't need to talk about all the steps right now. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the chloroplast. That's where the pigments are found, right? The chlorophyll. There's three parts to the chloroplast. We need to know this, and we need to know what's happening in each of these parts. So in my class, that would be a test question. So this big structure here is the chloroplast. We have individual discs inside. So I like to think of these as a stack of coins. And each quarter, my coins are quarters, each quarter is a thylakoid. So each one of these discs is a thylakoid. And then the whole row of quarters, the stack of thylakoids, is called a granum. So this is where the light-dependent reactions are occurring. That's today's topic. This fluid portion out here, I think of this analogous to the cytoplasm of the cell. So this is called the stroma. And the stroma is where the next phase that I'm not talking about in this video, the next phase is going to occur. So the light dependent is happening here in the thylakoids. Light independent is happening out here in the stroma? That's 2 test questions. Okay, so this is just showing you this is one set of reactions. In this case, water's turning into oxygen in the thylakoid. Overview, right? What goes in, what comes out? That's the light-dependent reactions. Over here, CO2 is being turned into some sort of organic molecule. That's the light-independent reactions. I can also see that the light-dependent reactions are making 2 things, NADPH and ATP. They're going to be used in the next phase. So there's quite a bit of reliability here. Remember I said everything is a cause and effect. The sun gives its energy to the chloroplast. The chlorophyll lose their electrons. They give their energy to ATP and NADPH. They give their energy to the Calvin cycle. Then the Calvin cycle turns the energy into glucose. So it's a constant conversion of energy forms. Okay, so the 2 phases, again, I'm starting big and then I'm going to get into smaller. The 2 phases are the light dependent, they require sun, and the light independent, they don't require sun. Overall, I want to know that the light dependent reactions are making 2 things. They're making ATP and NADPH. I need those for the next phase. In the light dependent reactions, or independent reactions, they're going to take ATP and NADPH and they're going to use it to make glucose. Okay? So that's where the products of one become the reactants of the next. So looking at the light-dependent reactions, I'm going to chop this up into 3 pieces. So in the first piece, the first stage, I have energy from the sun being absorbed right here in this photosystem. What happens when the sun's energy is absorbed? The energy is given to electrons. Electrons are excited. So excited, they jump to outer energy levels until they're so far from the nucleus, they're no longer held on by that atom or that molecule, and they leave the chlorophyll entirely. We're going to have to replace those electrons if things are going to continue. So water's going to split. Water releases oxygen. The plant don't need it. It does in another process, but right now we're going to give it off as a byproduct, and hydrogen is released. We're going to use those hydrogens in a little bit. And electrons are going to go back in to replace the ones that jumped out of the chlorophyll. In the second phase, so I have, this is light absorption phase or electron excitation. And then over here I have the electron transport phase. So in the second stage, these electrons, where do they go? They go into one of 2 electron transport chains. So here's one and here's the other. And what do they make? This one is making ATP. So one of the electron transport chains makes ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Remember, we talked about that in chemistry. That provides energy. The other one is going to jump up and make NADPH, nicotinamine adenine dinucleotide phosphate. Say that 5 times fast. So this is what's called an electron carrier. So it takes that electron from one reaction and kind of ties it up until it can be used in another reaction. And that's what its job is. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit more. That first stage was the light absorption or the electron excitation. So here again, we have the chlorophyll molecule. We have water being split. We have electrons getting excited. So chlorophyll absorbs photons. That's what we call light's energy. Electrons are excited. They leave the chlorophyll molecule. Water is split. Water replaces the electrons that were once there and are now gone. Okay, so that is called photolysis, breaking the water with sun's energy, photolysis. And this is where oxygen is being produced. So there's been studies run to see, is the oxygen coming from water or is it coming from CO2? And so they've been able to use radioactive isotopes that have traced the elements, and they know now for sure that the oxygen being released is the oxygen that was in the water. So oxygen is then released into the atmosphere for other organisms to breathe in for respiration, or maybe the plant uses it for its own respiration. Hydrogen ions are being released, and we're going to need those in the process of making ATP and NADPH. The electrons, they're going to go back in and replace the ones that have been lost. So I feel like we've said the same thing 3 times. in 3 different graphics. Stage 2, the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is a bunch of protein molecules that are found in the membrane. Does that look like a cell membrane? It should. It's the same makeup of the cell membrane, only this membrane is around the thylakoid, those individual discs. So in the thylakoid, we have a bunch of proteins. They're going to transfer the electron from one to the next, kind of like a relay. They're handing it off from one runner to the next, ultimately to make ATP. So the electron transport chain takes those excited electrons and then transfers them from one protein to the next through here. And as they go through those proteins, they lose a little bit of energy. And remember, energy is never gained or lost. It's only changed in form. So it's not technically lost. We have to transfer it. So these proteins are going to take some of the electron's energy. So the electron's energy is decreased. It's not necessarily lost. What this is a hydrogen ion pump. So when you hear that word pump, you should think of active transport. So there's a bunch of hydrogen atoms up here, and we're going to continue to pump hydrogen up into that crowded space. So this is inside of the thylakoid. So we're pumping more and more hydrogens into the thylakoid space. And that is the purpose of the first electron transport chain. So what happens to those hydrogens? So once we've accumulated a bunch of hydrogens inside of the thylakoid, they're going to diffuse out. That's so weird. Why would we pump them in if they're going to diffuse out? Remember, things are going to diffuse from a high to a low concentration. So if you don't keep that concentration inside the thylakoid high, eventually diffusion is going to really become inefficient because there won't be such a gradient. So we want to keep putting hydrogen ions in so that they can diffuse out. And they need to diffuse throughout because they move through this enzyme called ATP synthase. Remember, enzymes are named according to what they do quite often or what they work on. So ATP synthesis, it's going to make ATP, right? So as the hydrogen flows through the ATP synthase, this is a turbine type enzyme that'll bind the ADP and the P, and when it rotates, it binds the two together. So this is going to put ADP and phosphate and make ATP. That's the cell's energy. So that's why I'm not going to need sun later, because I'm storing the sun's energy ultimately in the form of ATP. So ADP is converted into ATP. The second electron transport chain, similar concept. This is coming out of the second photosystem that we were talking about. Electrons, they are excited, they jump out, they go into this protein channel where they're moved from one protein to another. And ultimately, these electrons take part in a bond. Bonds are made of electrons, right? So hydrogen from water, going to bind with electrons and NADP. And it's going to make NADPH, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. That's a mouthful. So one electron transport chain makes ATP, the second electron transport chain makes NADPH. Both of those things are needed for the Calvin cycle later. So final review, you got the sun's energy exciting electrons out of 2 photosystems, 1, 2. Each of those electrons are entering an electron transport chain, 1, 2, and each of those are going to make something. So this one makes ATP, and this one makes NADPH. Both NADPH and ATP are needed for the Calvin cycle later, for the light D-independent reactions. At the same time, water is being split, releasing oxygen into the atmosphere, hydrogen into the thylakoid space, and electrons are going to replace those that were excited and lost. And that is the whole of the light-dependent reactions. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks.